Conversation that I would necessarily have. I think it's perfectly true that it is a moment where you need to have that discussion.
The Queen's final words were supposed to stay private forever. Then Princess Anne walked into a courtroom and played the recording. Everything changed. Camilla was visibly destroyed. A single recording cracked the monarchy wide open. What was on that recording that broke Camilla so completely? Why did Princess Anne choose this moment to reveal it? Join us as we uncover the truth the palace never prepared for. The courtroom falls silent. There are days when you walk into a room and you just know something is different, something is heavier, something is about to happen that nobody is fully prepared for. And this was one of those days. The hearing had been described as routine, standard royal testimony, the kind of proceeding that journalists cover out of obligation rather than excitement, filling notebooks with careful words that rarely change anything. But from the moment people began taking their seats inside that courtroom, it was clear that routine was not what anyone was going to get. The tension was immediate, it was visible, it was shared by every single person in that room. Reporters who had covered the royal family for decades, legal teams who had seen everything, palace observers who thought nothing could surprise them anymore, all of them sitting a little straighter, speaking a little softer, watching the door with an attention that ordinary proceedings never produce. Then Princess Anne walked in, calm, completely unreadable, moving through the room with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from decades of discipline, from a lifetime of knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you came to do. And she sat down without hurry, without drama, without giving anything away. Behind her, Queen Camilla took her seat, and the difference between the two women in that moment was impossible to miss. Because where Anne was still and certain, Camilla was visibly unsettled, her composure showing cracks that the cameras found immediately and refused to leave. Whispers had been moving through royal circles for days, quiet and persistent, suggesting that Anne had brought something into that courtroom, something that had never been heard outside a tiny circle of people. A private recording, the Queen's own voice, her final message, kept hidden since those last quiet days at Balmoral. When Anne confirmed it existed, the entire room went still. The final days. At Balmoral Castle sits quietly in the Scottish Highlands, surrounded by mountains and open sky, far from the noise of London and the machinery of official royal life. And in September of 2022, it became the place where the longest reign in British history came gently and privately to its end. The Queen had always loved Balmoral. It was the one place where the weight of the crown felt slightly lighter, where she could breathe without the full pressure of public expectation pressing down on every moment, where she was not just the monarch, but simply herself. And it was fitting in a way that only became clear afterward that she chose to spend her final days there. Princess Anne was by her side. She had arrived before the rest of the family, before the urgent calls went out, before the world understood what was happening, and in those quiet hours before everything changed, it was Anne who sat closest, Anne who watched, Anne who stayed. The Queen was weak, visibly so, in ways she had spent her entire life training herself not to show. But even in that condition, she continued working. Official documents were brought to her bedside, papers requiring her signature, business of state that did not pause for failing health. Anne watched her mother move through those final hours, with a composure that was both deeply familiar and quietly heartbreaking, because she had grown up watching this woman hold herself together under pressures that would have broken most people, and here she was, doing it still, right to the very end. But beneath that composure, Anne noticed something she had not seen clearly before. A fear, not of dying. The Queen had never appeared afraid of that, but of what her death would leave behind, of the gaps it would create, of the questions it would open up inside a family and an institution that she had spent her entire life holding together through sheer force of will and presence. The monarchy without her voice, without her steadiness, without the particular authority that only she possessed, was something she had thought about deeply, and in those final days at Balmoral, she had done something about it, something that only Anne knew, something that had been kept carefully hidden from the rest of the world for years. She had recorded a message, her own voice, her own words, meant for a moment she would never live to see herself, but that she trusted Anne to know when to use. That moment had finally arrived. The recording, no one knew existed. For 2 years it sat hidden, not in a palace vault, not in an official archive, not in the custody of any government department or royal institution, but in the quiet keeping of one woman who had made a promise beside her mother's bed and had carried that promise in silence ever since, waiting for the moment when the weight of it needed to be shared with the world. Princess Anne revealed in that courtroom that the recording had been made during a private conversation in the final days at Balmoral, not a formal address, not an official statement prepared by advisors and carefully reviewed by palace communications teams, but something raw and personal and entirely real, the Queen speaking without the armor she wore for public appearances, in a voice that people who loved her would recognize immediately as the version of her that the cameras almost never reached. Palace insiders, according to sources familiar with the situation, had allegedly known that a recording existed, but had made a collective and deliberate decision to keep its existence hidden. The reasoning being that releasing it too soon, or in the wrong context, or without the right framing, could do more damage than good to an institution already navigating the turbulent waters of a post-Elizabethan era. But hidden is not the same as gone, and the courtroom was about to discover that. When the audio began, the quality was not perfect. It carried the particular intimacy of something recorded privately rather than produced professionally, and that imperfection made it more powerful rather than less, because it sounded exactly like what it was, a woman at the end of her life speaking honestly about the things that mattered most to her. The Queen's voice on that recording was tired, noticeably so, carrying the weight of age and illness in a way that her public appearances in those final months had worked hard to conceal. But it was also unmistakably her, the diction, the particular cadence, the quiet authority that had defined her public presence across an entire era of British history. Court officials had hesitated before allowing the audio to be played. There had been quiet conversations in the moments before, careful consultations, an awareness that once this was released into that room, it could not be taken back, but Anne had been clear and firm, and the decision had ultimately been made to allow it. The moment it began playing, Camilla's expression changed completely, and everyone in that courtroom saw it happen. The Queen's final plea. The recording lasted several minutes, and from the very first words it was clear that this was not a message designed for public consumption. It was not written by advisors, it was simply a woman, speaking honestly about the things she feared most and the things she loved most, and the gap between those two that kept her awake in the quiet hours at Balmoral when the rest of the house had gone to sleep. The Queen spoke about the monarchy, about what it meant to her, about the responsibility she had carried since she was a young woman, barely older than a girl, and the world had placed a crown on her head and asked her to be something steady and permanent in a world that was changing faster than anyone could comfortably manage. And she spoke about what she feared her death would do to that institution she had given everything to protect. She spoke about division, about the fractures she could see forming inside the family she had tried so hard to hold together, about the public battles and the private silences and the distance between people who should have been closer, and her voice carried in those moments a sadness that was entirely unguarded. The sadness of a mother watching something she built, beginning to crack at the edges and knowing she would not be there to hold it. Then came the moment that changed the temperature of the entire courtroom. The Queen spoke directly about Camilla, not in the careful diplomatic language of official statements, not in the measured tones of public endorsement, but personally, emotionally, with the kind of honesty that only surfaces when someone has stopped worrying about how their words will be received and started focusing only on whether they are true. She asked Anne to help the public accept Camilla, not just as a royal figure, not just as the wife of the king, but genuinely as someone worthy of the position she now occupied, as someone who deserved to be seen clearly rather than through the long shadow of history and old grief and the particular cruelty that public memory can carry across decades. Anne confirmed in her testimony that she had heard those words, that she had made the promise her mother was asking for, and that she had carried it in silence for 2 years, honoring it in every public statement she had made about Camilla since. Camilla's emotional collapse. There are moments that find people regardless of how prepared they believe themselves to be. Moments that move too fast and land too hard for any amount of training or discipline or public composure to fully absorb. And for Camilla, Queen of the United Kingdom, That moment arrived in a courtroom she had entered believing she understood what was coming. She had not understood, not fully, not in the way that hearing it made clear. As the recording continued playing, the courtroom watched something happen to Camilla that very few people had ever seen before, because this was a woman who had survived decades of public hostility, who had rebuilt her reputation through years of careful, disciplined royal service, who had learned through hard experience to present an exterior that gave very little away regardless of what was happening beneath it. That exterior was not holding. Witnesses inside the courtroom described what they saw in consistent terms. Tears that she was visibly trying to control, hands that were not entirely steady, a stillness in her body that looked less like composure and more like someone using every available resource simply to remain in their seat, to stay present in a room where the air had become almost too heavy to breathe comfortably. The Queen's words, heard now for the first time by most people in that room, revealed something that Camilla had perhaps known privately but had never heard spoken aloud in this way: how deeply the Queen had feared for her, how much she had worried that Camilla would face rejection after her death, that the public would never fully extend the acceptance that the Queen believed she deserved, that the crown Camilla now wore would always feel contested in ways that the Queen herself had never been able to fully resolve during her lifetime. Hearing those fears spoken in her mother-in-law's own voice, in a room full of strangers and cameras and the permanent record of legal proceedings, was something no amount of preparation could have made easier. The emotional pressure inside that courtroom had been building since the moment the recording began, and it reached something close to unbearable as the final minutes of the audio played out. The Queen's voice, tired but clear, saying the things she had needed to say to the one daughter she trusted to carry them forward. When the recording ended and the room returned to silence, Camilla had stopped trying to hold herself together, and the collapse that followed became, by the end of that day, the image that traveled around the world and refused to be forgotten. Anne finally speaks. The truth. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds a secret kept out of love rather than self-interest. It does not feel like deception from the inside. It feels like protection, like the careful carrying of something fragile that was placed in your hands by someone who trusted you above everyone else. And for 2 years, Princess Anne had carried exactly that kind of silence, steady and unbroken, while the world around her formed its own conclusions about why she had said the things she said and done the things she had done in the months following her mother's death. The courtroom was about to find out. Anne's testimony, delivered in the same calm and unhurried manner that characterizes everything she does in public, began dismantling assumptions that had been building since the Queen's funeral, since the first photographs of Anne standing beside Camilla, with what observers had described as unexpected warmth, since the public statements that had surprised people who expected the Princess Royal to maintain the cool distance that royal tradition and personal temperament both seemed to suggest was her natural position. She explained simply and without drama that her public support of Camilla had never been political. It had never been a calculated move designed to smooth the transition of power or manage public perception or demonstrate loyalty to her brother's new reign. It had been a promise, a specific and personal promise made at her mother's bedside in the final hours at Balmoral, when the Queen had asked her directly and Anne had said yes without hesitation, because saying yes to her mother in that moment was not a difficult decision. It was the only decision available to her. The courtroom absorbed this slowly because the implications of what Anne was describing were significant. Every statement she had made about Camilla since the Queen's death, every appearance, every carefully worded public endorsement, every moment of visible solidarity that the press had analyzed and debated and attributed to political calculation, had actually been the honoring of a deathbed promise that nobody outside that room at Balmoral had known existed. Anne described the weight of keeping the recording hidden, not as a burden she resented, but as a responsibility she had accepted fully, understanding that the right moment for it to surface was not hers to decide arbitrarily, but would eventually be determined by circumstances she could not entirely predict or control, and that when that moment came, she would be ready. That moment was now, in this courtroom, with Camilla present, with the legal proceedings providing a context that made the revelation not just appropriate, but necessary. And Anne had walked in prepared, as she always walks into everything, with complete clarity about what she was there to do and why. The testimony reshaped in real time how the courtroom understood the relationship between these two women, Anne and Camilla, bound not by natural affinity or political alliance, but by a promise made to the woman they had both loved and lost in a quiet room in Scotland, on the last night the monarchy was still hers to protect. What the courtroom had witnessed was not just legal testimony, it was the fulfillment of the final request of a queen who had understood, even at the very end, that the best way to protect what she had built was to trust the right person to carry it forward. She had chosen Anne, and Anne had not let her down. The bond between Anne and the Queen, to understand why the Queen trusted Anne with something she trusted to nobody else, you have to understand what that relationship actually was beneath the surface of official photographs and public appearances, and the carefully managed image of a family that presented unity as its default setting, regardless of what was happening behind closed doors. It was not the warmest relationship in the conventional sense. It was not built on easy affection or the kind of openly expressed love that makes for comfortable television. It was built on something older and in some ways more durable than that. It was built on recognition, on the particular understanding that passes between two people who see the world in fundamentally the same way and have organized their entire lives around the same set of values without ever needing to discuss it explicitly. The Queen had raised Anne in her own image more completely than she had raised any of her other children, not deliberately perhaps, not as a conscious project, but naturally in the way that values and habits and ways of moving through the world pass from one generation to the next, through daily proximity and quiet example, rather than formal instruction. Anne had learned discipline from watching her mother exercise it without complaint, across decades of public service. She had learned silence from watching the Queen absorb criticism and controversy and personal pain. Without allowing any of it to visibly alter her public bearing, she had learned that duty was not something you performed when it was convenient, but something you committed to permanently and without condition, and she had taken those lessons and applied them to her own life with a consistency that the Queen had noticed and respected and over time had come to rely on. Their relationship deepened as the Queen aged, as the circle of people she truly trusted contracted in the way that all circles contract with time, as the distance between her public role and her private fears grew wider and harder to bridge alone. Anne became the person she reached for most naturally. Not because the others were less loved, but because Anne was the one who could be trusted to receive difficult things steadily, without panic, without the need for reassurance, without making the burden heavier by her own reaction to it. By the final years, sources close to the royal household describe a dynamic that had evolved far beyond the formal mother and daughter relationship visible to the public. The Queen would seek Anne's counsel on matters that would have surprised people who assumed the lines of royal influence ran only through the male line, through Charles and his position as heir, through the formal structures of succession and institutional power. Anne had earned something different and in some ways more significant than formal power. She had earned her mother's complete trust, the kind that is not given as a reward or a title, but simply exists because it has been proven repeatedly over a very long time in circumstances that tested it genuinely. When the Queen recorded that message at Balmoral, she knew exactly whose hands to place it in, because she had spent a lifetime learning exactly what those hands were capable of holding without dropping. Charlotte, watching her great-aunt from a distance that will close as she grows older, is already learning the same lessons from the same source, and the Queen, through Anne, is still teaching them. The royal family fractures behind closed doors. There are institutions that present one face to the world and live a considerably more complicated reality behind the image they project. And the British monarchy has always been the most visible example of exactly that kind of gap. The public performance of unity maintained through decades of discipline and protocol, while the private reality shifts and fractures and rearranges itself in ways the official version never fully acknowledges. After the Queen's death, that gap widened. The tensions that had been building inside the royal household long before September of 2022 did not resolve themselves in the shared grief of a funeral or the unifying ritual of a coronation. They went underground, they became quieter and more careful, and in some ways more dangerous for the silence surrounding them, because things that cannot be spoken about openly do not disappear. They accumulate. They find other ways to express themselves. They surface eventually in forms that are harder to manage than the original problem would have been. The revelation of the recording inside that courtroom accelerated everything. Questions that had been forming quietly in the minds of people close to the institution began surfacing with an urgency that the careful management of royal communications could not easily contain. Who had known the recording existed? For how long? Under what circumstances had the decision been made to keep it hidden? And perhaps most pressingly, what did its contents mean for the relationships and reputations of the people it touched most directly? Sources allegedly familiar with the internal dynamics describe a period of intense private discussion in the immediate aftermath of the courtroom revelation. Conversations happening across multiple levels of the institution simultaneously. Between senior palace aides trying to understand the legal and reputational implications. Between family members processing what they had learned and what it changed about things they thought they had already understood. Between communications teams scrambling to get ahead of a story that had already moved faster than any prepared response could follow. The questions about Charles were particularly delicate. Had the king known about the recording? Had he been aware of the promise Anne had made? Had the careful public positioning of Camilla in the months following the Queen's death been coordinated with knowledge of what the recording contained? Or had it happened independently by instinct and obligation, without any of the parties involved understanding the full picture that would eventually emerge? Speculation about disagreements between Charles, Camilla, and senior palace aides moved through informed circles with the particular momentum of information that feels credible because it connects things that were previously disconnected, and Anne remained at the center of all of it, firm and unmoved, insisting with the quiet authority that is her defining characteristic, that her mother's voice had deserved to be heard, and that she had simply ensured it was. The fractures the recording exposed were not new ones. They were old ones, reopened by the pressure of a truth that had been held back for 2 years and released into a room full of people who were not all equally prepared for what hearing it would mean. The woman holding the monarchy together. There are people inside every institution who do not hold the most visible title or occupy the most prominent position, but without whom the entire structure would feel the absence immediately. People whose value is not measured in ceremony or headline appearances, but in the quiet, relentless accumulation of showing up every single day, without complaint, without drama, without asking whether the effort is being adequately recognized or rewarded. Inside the British royal family, that person is Princess Anne. While the headlines in the years following the Queen's death cycled through crisis after crisis, while Charles navigated his cancer diagnosis with a public stoicism that earned him sympathy but limited his operational capacity, while William and Kate managed their own carefully protected difficulties away from the full glare of public scrutiny, Anne continued, her calendar fuller than anyone else in the institution, her public appearances more numerous, her commitment to the work more visible and more consistent than any other working royal. She did not discuss it, she did not position it, she did not allow it to become a story about her own sacrifice or her own dedication. She simply did it, day after day, in the way she has always done everything because the work needed doing, and she was capable of doing it. And those two facts together were sufficient reason. The British public noticed, quietly at first and then with increasing warmth, the shift in how Anne was perceived becoming one of the more remarkable gradual movements in royal public opinion in recent memory. A woman who had spent decades being respected, but rarely celebrated, finding herself occupying a new and more central place in the affection of a country that was reassessing what it valued in its royal family. She began mentoring Princess Charlotte with a consistency and intentionality that sources close to the family describe as deeply deliberate, passing on the same lessons the Queen had passed to her: discipline, silence, duty, the understanding that the crown is a responsibility before it is anything else. The courtroom revelation had not diminished Anne in public estimation. It had deepened it, because what people saw when they understood the full picture was not a woman who had manipulated events for personal advantage, but a woman who had kept a sacred promise to her mother for 2 years without seeking credit for a single day of it. The Queen had chosen the right person, and the country was beginning to understand exactly why. The Queen's last words: change everything. There are moments that do not just change a news cycle or shift a conversation for a few days before the world moves on to the next story. There are moments that permanently alter the way people understand something they thought they already knew. Moments that reframe the past and reshape the future simultaneously. And what happened inside that courtroom was exactly that kind of moment. The recording changed everything it touched. The way people understood Camilla shifted in real time, because hearing the Queen's own voice, tired and honest and entirely unguarded, asking for her daughter-in-law to be accepted and protected and seen clearly, made it almost impossible to maintain the comfortable distance that public criticism requires. The Queen had humanized Camilla in the most direct way available to her, by asking for kindness on her behalf, in a moment when performance was no longer possible. The way people understood Anne shifted too, because the woman the public had always respected but rarely fully seen was suddenly visible in her entirety. Every public statement, every appearance beside Camilla, every carefully worded endorsement now understood not as political maneuvering, but as the quiet daily fulfillment of a promise made in love. Camilla's collapse in that courtroom, the tears and the shaking hands and the complete dissolution of a composure built across decades of difficult experience, became the image that traveled everywhere, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real, undeniably and completely real, in a world that has learned to be suspicious of royal emotion. The Queen was gone. She had been gone for 2 years, but in that courtroom, her voice was present, clear and purposeful, still shaping the institution she had given everything to protect, still reaching forward from beyond her own death to do the work she had never been able to stop doing while she was alive. Through Anne, her last words had finally found their moment.